Evolution of the bank system in the United States. In order to finance the American Revolution, the Continental Congress printed the new nation's first paper money, known as Continentals. The Continental Congress printed a huge amount of currency which led to rampant inflation, and without the strong support with easy counterfeiting, the Continental currency collapsed so quickly. After the end of the Revolutionary War, the nation had many debts. These were the two main financial problems facing the nation's founders around the time of the writing of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton thought that if the federal governments take over the states, it would be a good way to fix these problems. And this was one of his goals, the establishment of the federal power over the states. The first Bank of the United States. The first bank in the United States suggested by Alexander Hamilton, who is the first Treasury Secretary in the U.S., that existed from 1791 until 1811. Its first and main branch was in Philadelphia, with branches opening in Boston, New York, Charleston, Baltimore, Norfolk, Savannah, New Orleans, and Washington, D.C. It was the nation's first central bank, which played an important role in shaping and supporting the economy of the United States in the early years post-revolution. The formation of the first bank. Hamilton created the bank after the Bank of England, and he proposed that the federal government would be the major stockholder and the federal treasury would deposit its surplus revenue there. Its original intention was for the bank to print paper money and provide a stable national currency that could replace the continental dollar. Hamilton's proposal was strongly opposed by Thomas Jefferson and his anti-federalist compatriots. They were concerned that the first Bank of the United States was unconstitutional, would favor commercial interest over the interest of the agrarian economy, which they wanted to foster. Hamilton won this argument and the bank was formed in 1791, with 20 years charter, $10 million in capital, and 20% of its stock held by the federal government. The bank was the largest bank and the largest corporation of any type in the United States, due to the size of its capitalization. The role of the first bank. The first bank served as a fiscal agent of the government, but was not actually a government entity itself. Its functions. It paid the government's bill, collected and held tax revenues, made loans to the government, paid off the government's foreign creditors, taking deposits and issuing loans to individuals and corporations. In 1792, produced the Coinage Act. It did issue banknotes, which were used as a form of currency. These notes were usually issued after private borrowers took out loans from the bank, but they ended up in general circulation throughout the country. In 1811, the bank's charter was up. It had strong opposition and no real supporters since Alexander Hamilton died in his duel with Aaron Burr. The bank's charter was not renewed, but after the federal government was in need of financing as a result of the War of 1812, the Second Bank of the United States was chartered in 1816. The Second Bank of the United States. The Second Bank opened for business in Philadelphia in January 1817. It had much in common with the First Bank, including its functions and structure, but bigger. It had capital of $35 million. The Second Bank's reach was far greater than that of the First Bank. Its branches totaled 25 in number, compared to the only 8 for the First Bank. The extensive branch helped country's westward expansion and its economic growth. The branches provided credit to businesses and farmers, and these loans helped finance the production of goods and agricultural output, as well as the shipment of these goods to domestic and foreign destinations. Moreover, it helped move the money deposited in the branches to other parts of the nation, facilitating both the government's ability to make payers and the branch's ability to supply credit.
Bank leaders. William Jones in 1816. Under Jones' leadership, the bank first extended too much credit and reversed that trend too quickly. The result was a financial panic that drove the economy into a steep recession. Langdon Cheves in 1819. He instituted a strict retrenchment program of fewer loans, higher interest rates, and the sharp reduction of banknotes in circulation. His action enraged many and may have exacerbated the depression following the panic of 1819. But the bank regained its financial footing. He resigned from this position in 1822. Nicholas Biddle in 1823. He sponsored policies that restrained the supply of credit to the country's bank. He stabilized the investment money and discount markets. He regulated the money supply and safeguarded government deposits. The battle over the second bank. In 1829, Andrew Jackson, hero of the Battle of New Orleans and a determined foe of banks in general and the second bank in particular, was elected President of the United States. At the time Jackson was elected, the bank was operating successfully and was one of the most powerful organizations of the country. Jackson made his opposition to the bank clear from the beginning. When Bank President Nicholas Biddle heard Jackson intending to close the bank, he began to use the bank's resources against Jackson, which ignited a bitter struggle when Jackson refused the renewal of banks charter in 1832 and later began to pull federal deposit from its vaults. It was effectively crippled and withered until the charter expired in 1836. Free banks, 1837. While there had always been state-chartered banks in the United States, with laws of the Second Bank's Charter, there was a need for more banking. Consequently, during the period from 1837 to the Civil War, commonly known as the Free Banking Era, states passed free bank laws, which allowed banks to operate under a much less onerous charter. While banks were regulated, they were relatively free to enter the business by simply depositing government bonds with state auditors. Over this period, a private institution known as the Suffolk Bank in New England took on some of the roles typical of the central bank, such as clearing payment, exchanging notes, and disciplining banks that were over-issuing their notes. Also, in response to a rising volume of note and check transactions. Beginning to the late 1840s, the New York Clearinghouse Association was established in 1853 to provide a way for the city's bank to exchange notes and check and settle accounts. The National Bank System, 1863. The outbreak of the Civil War and the need to finance it led again to a renewed interest in a national bank. But this time, with the lessons of the second bank, the designers took a different approach, modeled on the free banking system. In 1863, they established what is known as the national banking system. The new system allowed banks to choose between a national charter and the state charter. With the national charter, banks had to issue government-printed bills or their own notes, and the notes had to be backed by federal bonds, which helped fund the war effort. In 1865, state banks' notes were taxed out of existence. Thus, in spite of all previous attempts, this was the first time a uniform national currency was established in the United States. The Panic of 1873, 1893, 1907. While the national banking system served its role in financing the war and establishing a uniform currency, it was fraught with at least one bank panic in every decade after the Civil War. A bank panic would often begin when depositors would learn that their bank was unable to meet withdrawal requests. This, in turn, caused a run on the bank in which a large number of depositors attempted to pull out their money, causing an otherwise solvent bank to fail. Seeing this, depositors at other banks were led to withdraw their funds, causing a system-wide panic. In 1893, a bank panic coincided with the worst depression the United States had ever seen, and the economy stabilized only after the intervention of financial mogul Margin, after another particularly bad panic and ensuing recession in 1907. Bankers and the Congress decided it was time to reconsider a centralized national bank.